bad sewing habits. I think we all have them. No matter how long you've been sewing, I think we all have one, two, maybe a couple more. I definitely have my fair share of bad sewing habits. Some of them in the back of my mind, I always think, yes, I should probably get rid of this one. Some of them, I do have a really good explanation of why I do that. And some are not necessarily bad sewing habits, but those are the things that drive you absolutely crazy off the wall in my videos. And I see that in the comments underneath. So today I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about it, to give you the reasoning, the explanation. And if you have a bad sewing habit of your own that you would like to share with us, please do so in the comments. Just a reminder to be kind and respectful to each other because we're all different. Some things might work for you, some things might work for me, and I say that because I know that I will be lit on fire for this first bad sewing habit. And yes, I do cut paper with my fabric scissors. There is a really good explanation for why I do that, so let's dig in. Like many of us who sew, I do have different scissors for different jobs. So I have the tiny little pair of scissors for little intricate things. Then I have these massive big shears that was a gift from my husband. Absolutely love them. They cut like a dream through anything. Then I have this pair of scissors that you see the most often in my videos. Then I have this pair, which is titanium nonstick, but they're pretty beat up. The handle is broken and they're pretty dull. And then I'm missing a pair, which is just for paper. And this is like a just tiny little paper scissors, and my daughter probably has them on her craft shelf. But out of all of these, the only pair of scissors that touches the paper is this one, and I'll tell you why. Because I don't know, a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, I don't remember exactly when, but some time ago, I did buy a scissor sharpener. Now, I've seen some horror reviews online about this, and I thought, you know what, I'll chance it. So I did buy it. Seems to be working just fine. I had it for quite a while now. And since my paper scissors do often disappear because my husband uses them, then my daughter uses them, I started I started to sort of like sometimes cut my tissue paper that I draft on with these scissors because I can just simply sharpen them after that and not to worry about it. As I mentioned, none of the other scissors do touch paper, just this pair. Now, just to be clear, I didn't purchase a scissor sharpener so that way I can use my fabric scissors and paper and not to worry about a thing. No, what actually happened is that at the time I was working a lot with double brushed polyester and a lot of linen. And those are the two factors that I could sort of pinpoint as to the reason why my scissors were getting so dull so fast. So I needed a solution where I could sharpen my scissors right there and there and sort of move on to the next task that I was doing. So that's why I got the scissor sharpener. And then a little while after that, my daughter sort of transitioned from the plastic child-safe scissors onto just normal paper scissors. And that's when my paper scissors slowly started, disappearing onto her craft shelf. So those two things aligning, and I found myself occasionally cutting tissue paper with my fabric scissors because then I could just sharpen it and that's it. And that's why once in a while you might see a clip here and there in my videos where I do cut tissue paper with my fabric scissors. Now, I usually do try to cut that out and edit that out because I don't want to inflict my bad sewing habits on anybody else, especially when I don't, have a chance to explain in every video why I do it and what is my remedy for doing that. But if you ever see that, that's the reasoning behind it. Needless to say that there are so many different scissor sharpeners out there. This is just kind of what works for me, and that's fine. And for those who are asking why this is the only pair of scissors that I use to cut paper, and that's because this is the only pair that is meant to be sharpened with this scissor sharpener. This next one for me is not necessarily a bad sewing habit because I see no difference in construction or neatness of the garment, whether I do it the right way or whether I do it the way that I do it. But I do know that it does drive some people up the wall, and that is the bad habit of working dirty, meaning not dirty as in a workspace, but what I mean by working and sewing dirty is that I don't clip the little threads and little serger tails as I'm working with the garment. Instead, I let them all be. Of course, it doesn't mean that I just let them hang out there and, my garment on the inside just looks blah. No, not at all. Whenever it's time to finish the hem or the armhole or the neckline or whatever else, all of those either get tucked in and then clipped, or I do tuck them in into the hem. It just depends on the thickness of the fabric, whether the threads are going to show through on the other side of the fabric whenever it's pressed, all those good things. But you see my garments wrong side out and my detailed tutorials, my upcycles all the time, and they don't look atrocious. In fact, as I mentioned, I don't see a difference between, you know, tidying it all up as you go and tidying it all up at the end whenever you are just about to finish that part of the garment. When I'm doing upcycles though, there is a really practical reason as to why I do it this way, and that's because, well, as you know, upcycles are a little bit different than sewing from scratch, and there's a lot of moving parts that are involved, and usually I'm limited on something, if not everything. Like, I work with limited amount of fabric, limited options for design, and a ton of other little things. So when I leave the ends of the seams as is, of course with back stitching, and then the same goes for the serger ends, it makes it a little bit easier to undo it in case if I have to change something up. Usually it doesn't happen, but it's life, and then things do happen. So in those cases, it really is for a practical reason to be able to undo the seam easily without untucking it first and then undoing it. I realize it's probably not the most sensational video about bad sewing habits, but I think it's about time that we have a deeper conversation in a sewing community as a whole, as of the techniques that we use, why we use them, and what are the certain things that each one of us does. Because sewing is hardly a linear hobby. It has so many different ways of completing things, different ways of thinking about it, different ways of pattern drafting, different ways of completing a garment, and it all varies between different parts of the world, between different people. And I also see a lot of sewing myths and a lot of sewing misconceptions, one of them being that there's only one way how a well-made garment should look on the outside and on the inside, and that's just not true. I mean, there's at least a dozen, if not more, ways how you can complete the same garment, and each one of them is going to be just as good as the previous one. So as always, I want to encourage you to look beyond what you see, scratch a little bit of the surface, discover what is the reason behind certain things, and then of course choose what's right for you. For this next bad sewing habit, I don't know, I can't get rid of it. I had it for years, and at this point I just think it's just my life, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate, and that is sewing when you are tired. And I have a really funny story to share with you that happened just recently, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks ago. And I've learned early on that when I'm really tired and when I'm sewing, I lose focus, especially when you're falling asleep and it's late at night, like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. Not the best timing when to be, sewing precise seams and things like that. So what happened just recently, I was basting a toile for a pair of pants, and it was really late, and I was basting it on a sewing machine, and the sewing machine was like this, and here's all my pattern pieces, and I was doing a toile from a muslin, so I have markings on all different sides of the muslin, so that way when I put it on, I can see the balance lines and things like that. So I've put the back and front together, and I put it right over here, and then I turned around, I selected this stitch and blah blah blah. I turned back, I grabbed it without even looking at it, I grabbed it and I started basting. And as I'm basting the inseam, I'm thinking to myself, well, I have to ease the back pattern piece into the front pattern piece, and I'm basting, and I get back to the bottom of the pant leg, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, that just was like a breeze. That was smooth. I eased it in without even thinking about it. And without even thinking about it, I proceeded to sew the side seam. What do you think? After I'm done, I go and I turn the pant leg right side out, and I realized that I sewed 2 front patterns together. And the funny thing about these incidents that clearly point that you should not sew and work on highly precise things like that when you are super tired and exhausted. So no matter how many times things like that happen, I still do it because, again, it's life. Sometimes the only time to sew is really late at night when everybody else is asleep, and I can just and do my own thing. So it's definitely a bad habit that I try to minimize, but life. This next one is not a bad sewing habit, yet I get criticized about it quite a bit in the comment section. In fact, I think it's actually a better way of how to do things, and in a lot of settings that are not home sewing settings, people do exactly that. And it's like a two-part thing. Number one is that I don't add seam allowances to the paper patterns that I draft, and I add them as I cut my fabric. And number two is that I use different seam allowances for different parts of the garment. I've done a couple of really detailed videos where I do explore different seam allowances and I explain why I use them, how I use them, and what's the logic behind it. But to boil it down in a nutshell, I think a lot of it stems from the misconceptions and some of those sewing myths that we have that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Like, for example, bigger seam allowance is always better, which can be, but not necessarily the case. Like, yes, if you are going to let out the garment later on, if you vary in size, sure, but bigger seam allowance doesn't always mean that it's a better seam allowance or a better constructed garment. The same thing as 5/8 of an inch seam allowance isn't a standard seam allowance everywhere. Just because commercial sewing patterns decided that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance should be used on all edges, then you sew the seam and then they ask you to trim it down, doesn't mean that that's the only way to go about it. In fact, there's easier ways how to go about it. But again, you always have to choose what's right for you, what's more convenient for you. And sometimes the way we learn things and the way that we've done things for decades is the easier way to go about it. Like, for example, for me, not tidying up all the loose threads as I sew, but doing that at the very end. You see, we all have our own little ways of how we do things. And as I mentioned, sewing is hardly a linear hobby. There's so many different ways how to go about it. The reason why I don't add seam allowances to the patterns that I draft is because then I can construct multiple garments from the same pattern, choosing the seam allowance depending on what kind of seam I'm going to be making. And here's a really good recent example. I made 2 pairs of palazzo pants. I did a full video for how I drafted them and how I sewed them. The green one is the pair made from lightweight cotton, and I wanted to construct the inside seams with French seams because the fabric was just light enough to be able to handle that technique, but I also wanted to be super nice and durable. And then this rayon viscose pair was super gentle, and I constructed it with just a straight stitch and a serged edge because the fabric was really lightweight and I wanted a very lightweight finish on it. So both seam allowances are different because I'm using different techniques, yet I'm using the same pattern that doesn't need any adjustments to it, only the width of the seam allowance as I cut my fabric. To lighten up the mood a little bit, here are 2 bad sewing habits that I actually successfully got rid of, and one of them was potentially dangerous. So what was happening, I would sew, I would take out the pins, and I would put the pin in my mouth. I know, it's just a big no-no, but it was so ingrained in me for years that I was just doing it, and I think it coincided with 2 things. Number one, my daughter was also sewing with me at times, and I did not want her to take bad habits from me, especially putting pins in the mouth. No, don't do it, please. If you're doing the same thing that I was doing, try to stop it. And the other thing is, it also kind of coincided with the fact that I started using less and less pins in my sewing and more of a finger pinning, notching, and things like that. So that kind of helped me with transitioning away from that really bad sewing habit. And the other one is that I stopped buying fabric on a whim. I do still have a fabric stash. It's definitely more manageable, and all of the fabrics in there are the ones that I'm definitely going to use. And now whenever I go shopping, for the last a few years now, I go with a list and I only buy what's on the list, for the rare exception if I really find a gem and I know I can't live. I just can't live without it, and maybe it's on sale, maybe it's in the red tag section, and I know that when it's gone, and I do have a project that I could use it for, then maybe yes. But most of the times I stick to my list, and nowadays I go into Joann's Fabric and I get out only with what was on the list. Even my husband was like, wow. As I mentioned, there's so many different ways in sewing, including how to sew knit necklines. So if you've been struggling with necklines on t-shirts and hoodies and things like that, then I have 4 different techniques right over here. Some are more standard and some are unconventional, but possibly a better fit for you. So definitely click right over here, and until next time, happy, thoughtful sewing, and I'll see you very soon in another video. Bye.